I'm Elizabeth Dackson. I'm a quilter and I love to paper piece. It didn't always happen that way though. Paper piecing was something I kind of fell into by accident. And after trying it a lot of times and having a lot of not so nice words about paper piecing, I've come to love it. Paper piecing is the kind of thing that takes a good bit of practice, but I'm here to help you with it today. When you paper piece, you're actually going to sew through the paper, through the fabric to make some really precise angles and beautiful blocks. So let me show you a paper piecing template that we'll work with today. This paper piecing template shows you lines, it shows you angles, it even has some markings that you'll see in my lovely chicken scratch handwriting that remind me what colors go where. These are just some mental notes to self to help me remember what fabrics I'm using where. I'm using some lovely solids, so I've written to myself what colors go in each section. You'll also see that there are notes about letters and numbers. These indicate to me which sections get sewn and placed first. So for example, A1 is the first section that I'm going to be placing, and I've written this note to myself here that pink is the color that I'm going to place there. Next is going to come A2, which I've written gray, and so on and so forth. As long as you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, you can paper piece. One thing you'll notice about this template is that there are lots of words and letters and numbers, and then on the flip side of the template is absolutely blank. The flip side of the template is where we're going to put all of the fabric. That's where the magic happens. Now to get started, we're going to flip this template over and get started lining up the fabric. Now usually I'll use natural light for that, but for this particular demonstration, we're going to use a light box. If you happen to ever stumble upon a light box for a good deal, it's super handy to have in your sewing room for lots of purposes. Paper piecing is a great example for that. So let's go ahead and head over to that light box and take a peek. Now, like I mentioned before, the fabric is going to go on the flip side of this template. So if we flip this guy over, we can still see the lines of our template coming through. You can mess around with the brightness of your light box so that you can see this a little bit better. Or if you're using natural light in your sewing room, you can just hold it up to a window, or if you happen to have a really bright lamp or something along those lines, you can use that as well. I have a light on my sewing machine, one of those like book light type of things that you can use for that purpose. So pink is my first color, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to place the pink fabric right over top of this A1 section here. You'll see that A1 and A2 meet one another, and I'm going to go ahead and line this right over top of that. And thinking about what I know about sewing, I know that A1 and A2 are going to meet, and there's going to have to be some seam allowance here. So I'm leaving enough fabric to cover that seam allowance. If I think back and think about my seam allowance knowledge, I know that 1/4 inch or so of fabric needs to be here. So I'm just folding back to make sure, hey, that looks like about 1/4 inch. I've sewn long enough to know about what that looks like. I don't need to measure it, nor do you. Once I'm sure that I've got that lined up just so, I take a look at my template to remind myself, what color is A2 again? Oh, hey, it's gray. I've got my gray fabric right here all ready to go. Line that up with that nice raw edge because like I said before, I've got that 1/4 inch of fabric right there ready to go for me, and that's where my A2 fabric is going to get lined up. Now, this is the tricky part. The very first seam that you put into this particular template is going to lock everything else in place. You can use a pin to hold this fabric in place. Personally, I don't tend to use pins a whole lot because it tends to wrinkle the paper, which then can wrinkle the fabric. My sewing machine's right here. My 2 thumbs, pretty good and steady. So I'm just going to go and hold nice and tight, bring it right over to the sewing machine. Now, if I line things up right like this, I cannot see my lines. So it's really important that you take the moment and think about what you're doing to flip that template over to make sure that those lines are facing you. The lines are your guides. There's no need to pay attention to your seam allowance on your sewing machine in any way, shape, or form because those lines on your guides here on your templates are all that you need to make sure that you're sewing nice and straight. So I'm going to go ahead and sew along this line. I have, however, gone ahead and shortened my seam allowance, or shortened my stitch length, I should say, because when you're paper piecing, it's important to shorten that stitch length, and I'll tell you why. Have you ever tried to tear paper? Think about it. We're using just regular plain old printer paper, and what we're doing with that shortened stitch length is we're literally perforating the paper as we go with the needle. By doing so, we're going to make it much, much easier to go ahead and tear that paper when we're all done. So now that we've sewn that very first seam, we can go ahead and bring it right back over to the light box. And you'll see that my fabric did not quite line up perfectly straight, but it's close enough. We can open up that seam. I'm gonna finger press it to make sure that things are nice and straight. You can also set the seam with an iron. Flip it nice and open, and now we've got a nice, perfect little seam right here. I'm gonna go ahead and add on A3 the same way. I'm gonna just take a peek to check out what color we're doing. We're adding dark purple, as my note indicates to me. I see my line is right here. Now, when I flip this over, I can't really see the line so great. So what I can do is I can go ahead and fold back that fabric and give a nice crease to my pink fabric once I find where that 1/4 inch is. You can also use rulers to do this step for you, or like I said, you can hold that fabric up to a nice light source. Once I find that 1/4 inch, I can line up my purple fabric like so, bring it on over to the sewing machine, and give that nice seam a good sew. Okay, I'm using a nice lightweight sewing thread for this because we're paper piecing, so it's really important that we add as little bulk as possible. It's actually a paper piecing thread that's really designed for this purpose, so it's really perfect for this kind of application. So now this is the first time that we're dealing with this. We're actually having a good amount of bulk here in this particular seam, so we need to get rid of some of this. So we are gonna just use a handheld scissor to trim some of this excess away. You could use a rotary cutter. I will tell you, having taught this to many, many sewists over the years, I've seen a good number of people cut into their templates with a rotary cutter, so I don't tend to recommend that if you're just getting started with paper piecing. I'd recommend that you stick with just the regular scissors for a good long while until you get used to paper piecing. All I'm doing here is adding on the next section or so, which is my next section, my gray section. I'm checking to make sure that I've got enough fabric to cover the A4 section. Then I'm gonna add on A5 in just the same fashion, so that we can get to trimming these templates, because that's one of the areas where folks tend to get tripped up in paper piecing. A lot of times when you're paper piecing, you tend to work with really unusual shapes and angles, and that can be really tricky to deal with. It can be a little bit intimidating. I know that when I started paper piecing, that was one of the things that I struggled with most, was figuring out how do all of these puzzle pieces come together to create a square? Because when you look at this particular shape, for example, it certainly does not look like it's ever going to turn into a square. It certainly doesn't look like it's a triangle. It looks like it's got a shape lopped off. Well, it does. And you'll see in the project sheet for this particular project that there is a second template that you'll work with that ultimately turns this particular template into a traditional right triangle that ultimately, when sewn together with another matching right triangle, can create a square, and then ultimately, 4 of those guys put together will create a finished block. So once we're finished sewing that A template together, we get this lovely, really not so super attractive block, or template, I should say. It doesn't really look like anything yet because we haven't trimmed it up. So let's go back over to the cutting table and see what happens when we trim. So when we trim any paper pieced block, one of the things that's really important to understand is that what we're doing is we're trimming off excess fabric to come to a finished size. To do this, we have to flip the finished piece over. If we don't do that, we can't see what we're doing. We've got to be able to see those lines. So we're always going to be sewing on that wrong side of the paper, but trimming and sewing on the printed side of the paper. So you'll follow these dotted lines to trim up your finished templates. Let's go ahead and grab the ruler and rotary cutter to go ahead and trim this up so it'll look just like this finished example right here. Let's flip our ruler over so we can actually see what we're doing. I will tell you that having done this for a long time, I always measure from the dark line here that surrounds each template, just in case my printer has misbehaved and printed things at a size that is not quite what it should have done, just in case that dotted line does not quite measure out as a perfect 1/4 inch. And one more side, and you'll see that the corners are notched so that you don't have to have dog ears. You can take the moment to trim those, or you can skip over those, whatever you prefer, and ultimately finish out with a nice, lovely trimmed template. And you'll repeat this process for any paper piecing template that you wind up with. Ultimately, once you flip these guys over, you'll see that these guys repeat in the finished block over and over again, and you can alternate colors, make any color choices that you want to finish up a lovely block like this. Here are some other examples that you can see where I've done some other additional paper piecing. You'll see lots of beautiful triangles, arrow shapes. You can do just about anything with paper piecing, and I hope that this tutorial has really helped you understand the basics of paper piecing.